Great. Okay, so if you're watching as a webinar and there's any problems with the sound or you can't see anything, please just say something in the chat. If you could limit the chat just to questions that are relevant and also technical issues, that would be brilliant. Thank you very much. So just a little bit of housekeeping. We've got quite a lot of me talking today. Most of the workshops will be quite interactive, but for my sake and yours, we're going to have breaks quite regularly, probably about once an hour. We'll just take a little break and then obviously lunchtime. And then if you want to come back in the afternoon, we've got a second round of workshops. Then toilets are just around the corner. Hopefully if you're at home, you know where the toilet is. Okay, great. So look, we're going to start today. So this is the first workshop, which is essentially looking really at what interdependence is and an introduction to the global climate change challenge. So just to kind of go over what we're going to be covering today. So the first part, a little bit of an introduction, some of the background and the history, defining some key terms, and then looking at really what interdependence is all about. So who, why, what, and how. If we have time this morning, we'll look at the interdependence principles. We may not, so we might push that into the afternoon. And then in the afternoon, getting a little bit more practical, so how we work, how we're organising, different working groups, and then again, if we have time at the end, how to run an effective working group meeting, which hopefully you will be doing very soon. So, to introduce the concept, you know, I might actually just switch to the PDF as the font has gone strange. Let's see this full screen. Yeah. Okay, so really just to introduce the concept and really where this idea came from. Essentially in 2017 there was a competition called the New Shape, which was from the Global Challenges Foundation. So a Swedish billionaire who's made his money in the world of finance set up a foundation which is really looking at global systemic challenges. And he issued a call for proposals, or his organization did, which was inviting people to submit essentially a thesis looking at how we might be able to create essentially a governance model that would be equitable, accountable, and sustainable, capable of addressing current global challenges and also those that might be emerging in the future. And there was a $5 million prize, and so being perhaps sort of person I am, I thought, well, that's quite an interesting competition. I've been working in this space for a long time, maybe I should have a go, and got together with a group of people to start thinking about that concept. And I thought there'll only be maybe a couple of hundred people that might submit an entry, because it was a 10,000 word essay. I was actually delighted to find out that nearly 3,000 people from around the world put their heads together and thought, you know, how do we build a better future, a better world? It's very inspiring. The question was actually really focused on how we might reform the United Nations to make it a more effective body. Our group actually thought perhaps the United Nations is not the place to start, and if we were thinking really of how we might create something different, perhaps we could put that to one side and think about something that might actually have a chance of working. I know that sounds maybe a little bit facetious, but trying to reform the UN may be less doable than some other ideas out there. So you can have a look to see the winning entries. There was one that involved blockchain, and the other two actually did pretty much answer the question, looking at a global voting system, I believe. So just to define a few terms then, so really interdependence, in a nutshell, we decided to call the concept interdependence because it's a single word that really encapsulates the value system that we're really about trying to propagate here. So the idea that we are and everything on the planet is interdependent, not exactly the same as interconnected. You may have seen David Attenborough's new series, One Planet. He seems to be the biggest champion now for interdependence. It's pretty much his main message. It's becoming increasingly difficult to deny that we live on one planet with finite resources where actions by one group can indeed affect everybody. And so it's really thinking about whether it's time for us to update our societal operating model, but also our governance system, to one that actually really reflects that reality. And that at the core is what the interdependence concept is all about. We were told by many when we were thinking about a name that it's too long, it has too many syllables, so we've sort of gone against every branding guru's advice there, but I think people are perhaps smarter than branding people give them credit for. So the interdependence blueprint. Now, it's all very well and good to come up with grand theories and say we're going to change the world, but unless you've actually got a plan or a vision for how we might get there, arguably it's not really worth talking about. I mean, maybe others might disagree, but coming very much from an entrepreneurial background, for me, when we started this project, it really seemed that it wasn't really worth going all that way unless there was a clear roadmap for how we might think about transforming things. Whether or not we actually get there, who knows, and that will be largely down to yourselves, other volunteers, other people who get involved and make it their own as we go. But at least there is a suggestion of how we might do it. And that ultimately is what we're calling the interdependence blueprint. So the interdependence community, that is effectively you, which at the moment might not be a huge group of people, but we have had several hundred people sign up to work on this project over the summer, and that's very inspiring considering that it's the first iteration of this project. And that really is a community that we hope to grow exponentially over time, because as we'll see when we start to look at some of the climate change issues, we're facing an exponential challenge on the other side. So I think we have to fight exponential change with exponential solutions. So the Global Climate Change Challenge, that is ultimately a volunteer support and training program for anybody that wants to be part of the interdependence community and who might want to work on the interdependence blueprint. And again, that's something that will be improving over time, but it's essentially something that is designed to resource participants to help them scale climate resilience. That's really the core of what we're looking to do here. Longer term, it would be to build a better world. So, next phase is really looking then at who, why, what and how. So to begin, who? So the Interdependence Agency, set up as a UK registered not-for-profit, and its single aim is to scale the interdependence blueprint. So that really means that it is the driving force that is coordinating all of the other different bits of the plan, and over time it will be taking on more responsibilities, but to begin with, its core function is to be running and administering the Global Climate Change Challenge and supporting volunteers as we scale things up. The Interdependence Treasury, again, is a UK registered not-for-profit. We are looking at setting that up as a charity. The latest data is it takes 6 to 12 months to register as a charity in the UK, so it might take a bit of time. And that is there essentially to be the custodian of any donations that we receive and the issuer of interdependence bonds, which we will talk about later and in more detail on Thursday. Now, both of these organisations, and they're working very closely together, are guided by a model of sustainable leadership that is really about helping groups of people address shared dilemmas that the majority assess to be beneficial and significant, and that would not otherwise have been achieved. And that was a definition that came out of a paper written by Jem Bendel, who we will explore a bit more of the deep adaptation agenda next week. That's on Monday. And really it's looking at defining a model of leadership, and we're going to talk about that quite a lot over the next few weeks, that is perhaps not quite the same as the old model of leadership, which might have been very egocentric or follow the leader, but one which is much more about empowering others and enabling others, not necessarily for the benefit of that leader, shall we say. And also that when we're looking at these challenges, they have to actually be contributing to some sort of good, as opposed to not really achieving very much at all. So, why are we doing this, and why do we think that we might want to need, we might need to be looking at building some sort of better future? Well, this list is not exhaustive by any means, but I've tried to sort of give a bit of a sense of some of the key global systemic challenges that we've identified, and many others. I would say that there's lots of commentators that have looked at this in much more detail, but it's just to give you a little bit of a sense of where this concept is coming from. So if the proposition is to be transitioning to a more equitable, accountable and sustainable society, or operating model, as we like to call it, then it makes sense to really look at, well, whether or not we actually live in a paradigm that is equitable, that is accountable, that is sustainable. So this first part is looking at equity. So this first of all, this chart is taken from Capital in the 21st Century, written by Thomas Piketty, which had quite a lot of coverage when it was published a couple of years ago. And it's really looking at the number of billionaires in the world, according to Forbes. That's over the last 20 years or so. And we can see that that number is pretty steadily increasing over that time horizon. This chart here is looking at billionaires as a fraction of global population and wealth. Again, we can see that pretty steadily increasing over time. Sound again?
We might have no sound.
Is that something to do with this?
No. Let's just try it. So.
Do you want me to say something?
I should be able to hear it. It's not.
That says input volume right down.
That's fine.
Julian, you also got mute here.
Anyway.
That's probably creating a feedback loop, isn't it? Does that mean we've had no sound so far? Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, all right, sorry about that. Okay, so yeah, this chart really looking at the billionaires as a fraction of the global population. Again, steadily increasing. And then here we have a look at essentially share of the top wealth. So we've got the 1 out of 20 million fractile, and then 1 out of 100. And again, we can see this steadily increasing over the last 20 years or so. Now, this is particularly interesting, sort of summarizes it all really, where we can see that we've got the top earners or wealth holders. So their wealth has grown by 6.8%, whereas if we look down at the bottom, we've got the adult world population around about 2%. And so whether we look at the top 0.1% up there, or indeed the next group, we can see that the wealth for all those groups has essentially been growing at about 3 times faster. And I guess my overall point here is that we have a system that is converging towards, or diverging I should say, sorry, towards greater and greater wealth inequality. So there are several books out there. Just want to highlight 2 of them. So the Spirit Level essentially is really looking quite extensively at why growing income inequality is indeed worse for just about everybody, including the wealthiest in society. And then another book which I found particularly interesting called Affluenza, where essentially it's an anthropologist going around the world and interviewing various different people, many of whom are incredibly wealthy, and finding that actually, surprise, surprise, money doesn't make people happy. What he actually finds makes people happy is essentially being respected by one's peers, doing something with purpose, and being ultimately part of a community. I think that's quite interesting findings there. So I guess on this theme of whether or not we live in an equitable society. So obviously I've used the example of the UK here, as that's where we're based. I'm very much aware that regional variation is pretty key here. But what's particularly interesting in this, and we've had a massive rise in the use of food banks over the last, 10 years or so, pretty much since the last financial crisis. But it would appear that a lot of people, something like 30% of people who are using food banks are on a low income. So that's people essentially who are working, but are not earning enough to actually feed themselves properly. Which is pretty shocking considering that I think we're the 6th largest economy in the world, must be the 5th. Now another rather scary stat, and if you live in London, you'll have seen this pretty extensively, but you could go to Paris, you could go to San Francisco, London is not alone, is the rise of homelessness. So Shelter are now saying that 320,000 homeless people are homeless in the UK, which is 1 in 200 people, which is pretty huge number or huge percentage. And it's the sort of thing that you can imagine it happening to anybody really. Anybody you might know. That's quite a shocking stat. There was actually a gender index that was published this morning. Maybe some of you might have seen it. In the UK, there was recently some legislation which required companies to report on the gender pay gap. No massive surprise here, but the data that was revealed from the companies that did actually report, many of them did not, that men were paid considerably more on average. And around the world, you can have a look for yourselves at the index, but clearly we have a long way to go in reaching gender equality. So I would argue that, again, that's quite a considerable area where we do not have equity in our society. Now there's also an issue of equity between the old and the young, and this is perhaps borne out most in the area of pensions. So this is a chart from the US, which is really showing how the liabilities for pensions, and pension funds in particular, is outstripping the assets that they hold. Now, although this is just from the US, it's very similar in most of the Western world. Now, one of the challenges there is that in order for these pensions liabilities to be met, the burden will have to fall on younger people who are still working, most likely through increase in taxes, or there may even be a bailout of the pension fund industry, a bit like we had with the banks, as clearly that is not a sustainable model. And then finally just to look at technology companies in general. And really what I want to say here is that we have an awful lot of innovation in our modern day society, but ultimately who controls it? Who owns it? Is it distributed fairly amongst the population? If we have a breakthrough in artificial intelligence, what will happen with that? Will it be used to treat all known diseases for man, or will it be used to make somebody very, very rich? And I would argue that that is a core challenge with the way that we have geared our society today, where the majority of the innovation is coming from private profit corporations that are indeed privately owned. So I want to move now into the idea of accountability and to ask the question of whether or not we live in an accountable society. So I just mentioned limited liability corporations who essentially exist to legally be obliged to maximize profit. And it's particularly interesting when you look back at the history of, essentially humanity, but the innovation of creating a limited liability corporation certainly enabled us to do many, many wonderful things. But it's also potentially opened a Pandora's box where we have corporations that are essentially able to destroy the planet and really not have much recourse against them. Indeed, in the UK, you can set up a company and your liability is capped at whatever you initially put in. So it's typically £1. Obviously, we do have various legal systems which sometimes do challenge people, but typically the liability is with the company itself and not an individual. So just to give a couple of examples, we recently had a dam collapse in Brazil. I think that's the second one in the last 2 years. The theme is pretty standard. Company cutting corners in terms of environmental standards, dam collapses, kills lots of people, destroys environment. Now, depending on what price you might put on that, it's debatable whether the fines, or if there are indeed any fines imposed on that company, would equal the damage caused. This is just an example from the Deepwater Horizon spill. Again, there were significant fines, but really, is it right that we have companies that can destroy vast ecosystems? And if you look in fact at climate change, perhaps to push humanity right to the brink. Again, that's a limited liability corporation that is essentially doing what it was set up to do, which is maximize profit. It is fulfilling its legal obligation to do that. Obviously, there are different ways of making money. You don't have to destroy the planet, but a lot of companies do seem to be doing that. So, talking about accountable societies, well, a few years ago we had Edward Snowden come out and reveal that large swathes of data are recorded and monitored pretty much indiscriminately by state entities. If you want to read more about what was revealed exactly, there's a link at the bottom there. But essentially, I think that the main point here is that we live in a society where we are surveilled, I mean in the UK particularly, to such a great extent that there's even been suggestions that people are sometimes censoring their behaviour now online as a result of these revelations. Okay, sustainability. So, do we live in a sustainable society? First point I want to pick up on here then is GDP, so gross domestic product. There was actually an article at the beginning of this week, former head of the civil service in the UK calling for well-being to replace GDP as the measure of progress. Now, GDP is essentially really how much stuff is made within a country, and that's not necessarily the be-all and end-all in terms of what we might consider to be progress or well-being of a society. It's arguable that growth, typically referred to and measured in units of GDP, has become almost like an ideology that we are fixated on. So if that is essentially what we are continually solving for in our economy, I'd argue that it's going to be challenging to actually build a better one. So, slightly more complicated one here, fractional reserve banking. So this essentially enables banks, so we'll just go for this diagram. So if somebody puts money into a bank, they are then able to lend out typically 10 times more than the amount that they have as a reserve, and then to charge interest on that additional loan. So if you or I started to print our own money at home, we'd probably be arrested pretty quickly. But it turns out that if you're a private bank, you can. And you can also charge interest on it. So this is just an example here. I don't know how clear it might be on the screen. But we have somebody come along, they put $1,000 into a bank. So 100 gets used as a reserve, 900 is loaned out. That would then essentially create more money in the system. We then end up in a repeat of that. So we have an exponentially increasing supply of money, but also, if it is being loaned out, an exponentially increasing supply of debt in the system, which again is a systemic global challenge in my view. So, looking at increasing debt, there's much talk about how, for example, in the UK we have a never-ending increase in the deficit, so government spending. You might see in America every now and again it reaches a ceiling and Congress freezes up and they have to approve going over the limit even more. Now, given that we have a system that is exponentially increasing the amount of debt, it's not particularly surprising that government debt is exponentially increasing, or going up at least over time. Now, the challenge with that, and much of Western Europe has just experienced austerity, really in the name of trying to service this debt, which has led to all kinds of cuts in social care and welfare. But it's almost an ideological choice that we actually have a system that is fueling debt, rather than necessarily something that has to be there. So this is just a look at government debt from around the world as a percentage of GDP. And what's particularly interesting is that we can see that it spiked around about the time of World War I, and then again around the time of World War II, which makes sense. Governments were investing large amounts of money in fighting wars. But we actually also used to have a gold standard, whereby money was actually backed by a precious metal. And what we can see is that once the gold standard ended, essentially there wasn't essentially any control on the amount of money in the system. That debt increased quite considerably. So maybe just to finish the point there, it's really that I don't think you can have a system where the amount of debt in the system is increasing forever, and for that to be sustainable, I think is the ultimate point here. You need to somehow transition away from that. Now, this is looking at, it's a little bit of a perhaps confusing chart, but we've got the ore grades of a series of different elements up there. So we've got copper, gold, lead, zinc, uranium, nickel, diamonds. And what we essentially see is that over this last 160 odd years, the ore grades have been declining for just about every one of these elements. And that the general trend is certainly going down. And what this is typically representative of is the idea that we find the low-hanging fruit pretty quickly, and then it becomes more and more difficult and more expensive to extract the various different, whether it be oil and gas or any other metal, and that costs more and more money, because it's harder to find. So this is just a sort of general trend that we typically find over time, where you almost reach a peak, the idea of almost like peak minerals, where to begin with, it's relatively cheap, it's easy to find, and then at a certain point in time, that starts to decline, and also the environmental or social, economical, environmental costs will be going up as well. Now, arguably, one of the reasons that we are starting to see, or we have seen, very low growth measured in GDP over the last 10, 20 years or so, is that essentially this chart has got to the point where for various different minerals that we are exploiting from the earth, we've actually reached the point where it's becoming increasingly difficult to extract value from them. There's actually a concept known as, so we have in the investment world, ROI, or return on investment. So there's return on energy investment. And what that is essentially saying is that if you have to expend, let's say, 100 units of energy to get oil out of the ground, and then when you burn that, you get 150 units, okay, well, that makes sense, you're plus 50. But as that margin starts to get smaller and tighter, actually it's debatable how much sense it actually makes to be extracting those kind of commodities. One example again there would be extracting oil or gas from the Arctic, where the amount of money it's costing and the amount of energy it's taking to actually get the stuff out of the ground, and also, so if we look at, for example, tar sands, that's some of the, what's the word? I guess the least efficient in terms of converting that actually to energy. So yeah, you really do have to question whether or not some of this extraction makes sense. Okay, so now we're going to move on to some of these more environmental issues. So this is the 9 planetary boundaries from the Stockholm Resilience Centre. I should say this chart is actually from 2015, and I have a sneaky feeling that if they went back over it, it would be worse if we looked at it today. But just to give you a bit of a sense, what they've tried to do is map these different planetary boundaries that they essentially believe need to be in some sort of balance in order for things to be, I'd say, safe. That's what the word they've used. And so we can see with various different elements here that we are into the orange or the red zone. Several are not quantified, and several are in the zone of uncertainty, where they're so that's the yellow, where they're saying that they are not entirely sure. So it could be bad, but they don't quite have enough data yet. And so I guess what that really is suggesting is that if we're sort of looking at the dashboard, the control panel of planet Earth, there are quite a few buttons that are flashing red right now. So you might have seen the news recently, last 6 months or so, but it seems that humanity has wiped out 60% of animal populations since the 70s. And another slightly worrying fact is that we've seen a massive plunge in insect numbers as well. Insects are pollinators, they're often part of the food chain for other animals. I mean, this is deeply worrying. No other way to put it, really. And then looking at soil, so there's also been various different bits of research that have come out that are suggesting that the quality of the soil is being degraded to the point where the number of harvests we might actually have, I'm sure that varies quite a lot from different places, but in some places saying sort of 30 to 40 years, talking about the UK. So again, clearly we're not doing something right in terms of our farming techniques, many of which are monoculture, an awful lot of pesticides being used. I think if some of our ancestors knew what we were doing now, they'd sort of say, you've gone mad. There's lots of techniques there that are used, which are much more about preserving the land and working with it and making sure that it's preserved for future generations. Okay, so this is looking then at some of the environmental, climate-related disasters, and I think we probably agree that we can see a pretty clear increasing trend over time. So we've got the brown, which is the bottom one, that's geophysical disasters. The blue, sort of dark blue, is climate-related, and then the economic damage. And I think the economic damage is also particularly interesting when you look at major climatic events. We have much of the insurance industry that is suggesting that a 3-degree plus world would be uninsurable. There's quite considerable issues every time you have a major disaster. So this is just a little bit of, recent news. So this was Australia back in January. They actually had to introduce a new colour for their weather map. That's the dark purple in the middle. And essentially what often happens is when there's extreme weather is that the oxygen changes in rivers, and we see die-offs with, for example here, fish. And at the same time that was happening, in America we had a pretty massive deep freeze, which was actually due to the polar vortex shifting. So sort of one half of the planet burning, the other one freezing. Okay, so essentially that's just to give a little bit of a sense. I'm sure you're probably familiar with much of that stuff already, but really why we might dare to say that we might need to do something about this. So what is it exactly that we're looking to do and what we're proposing? So I think that maybe the first thing, just to sort of add a bit of context, is so this is taken from a chart given by one of our trustees actually, who's been involved in the transition towns movement for the last 10 years or so. And it's really looking at, I guess, this idea of uncertainty. And uncertainty is obviously something that's very challenging to sometimes to sit with. But ultimately, we don't really know what's going to happen. We've got the sort of eternal growth optimists that would say, well, we can just keep expending these resources forever. I think common sense would suggest that that's not possible. Then we have the sort of techno-optimists that say, well, we can fix it all with some technology. That may be possible. And then this collapse scenario is really saying, well, if we don't do anything and we hit a wall, then we could see quite a considerable breakdown. And there are various different definitions of really what a collapse means, and some of those are explored in the deep adaptation workshop. Whether or not we have some sort of straight line collapse or maybe more of a gradual transition, the point really is that we need to get off the path that is probably going to lead to collapse. And really this model of interdependence is trying to acknowledge that reality, that be aware of what's actually going on when we look at the climate science, and think about how we can build more resilience to what may be coming, but also longer term build something that perhaps means that we avoid simply repeating the same problem over and over again. Okay, so here's just a few examples of what a more equitable, accountable and sustainable world might look like if we were thinking about a governance model that was designed to, as I say, not simply repeat the same problems. So having a money system that is not debt-based and not interest-bearing would go some way to solving some of those issues. Having companies that were not for private profit, didn't have limited liability. So we have not-for-profit structures, they already exist, and some of the most innovative companies in the world are in fact not-for-profits. But essentially what they do is they exist for the benefit of the community, which in that case is the stakeholders of the company, as opposed to for the benefit of typically a few or maybe several individuals. A constitution that protects the people and the planet. Unfortunately, although we do have bits of regulation that seem to be designed to at least counter some of the negative effects that we are experiencing, we often find that there is regulation that's designed to pretty much oppose it and do the exact opposite. So, and I would argue that a lot of that is driven by our obsession with economic growth and GDP. Now, this is certainly not an exhaustive list. This is just a few examples. But a governance model that ensured gender balance, for example. I mean, I really do think, I mean, obviously we can divide the population in many different ways, but you know, we're pretty much 50% men, 50% women, more or less. It is pretty ridiculous that we have such a massive gender imbalance at this stage. So these are just a couple of components, really, of thinking about how we might do things differently. But bringing it back down to earth a little bit, what we're really looking at to begin with is, you know, Rome wasn't built in a day, is really thinking about, in particular, climate resilience. Because if we don't address that, it's debatable how much of a civilization that we'll have to piece back together. So just on the left here, we've got Maslow's hierarchy of needs, again simplified, but you know, purpose, community, food, warmth, shelter. This is just bringing things back down to basics in terms of what is it that really humans need. And so in terms of the interdependence model, what we're really focusing on is community. So how do we rebuild community in well, cities like very anonymous large cities throughout most of the West? To a large extent, community has been eroded, and we see sort of the a pervasive individualism that to some extent has eroded communities. Food and energy, so meeting those basic needs, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But then in terms of a purpose, if we really do want to sort of reunite people around a common goal, I can't think of much better than, given what we've said about some of these systemic challenges, but actually working towards building something better, something that is more equitable, accountable, and sustainable. So that's sort of the, let's say, the context for this concept. And now we'll go into a little bit more detail in a second.
Can we just have another go at the sound?
So sorry about the technical interlude, although hopefully you got some free breakfast. So yeah, we'll upload those online afterwards. Okay, so essentially just kind of giving a bit of context of how this all fits together. So ultimately, when we're talking about interdependence, really looking at the governance model that we started to talk about there. So thinking about what are those key ingredients that might enable us to avoid perpetually falling back into the same trap. The interdependence bond, we'll talk about that in a minute, but it's really thinking about how do we recycle the money we have in the current system to actually build the infrastructure we so urgently need to create. And then these three bits at the bottom, so essentially a food and energy network that we'll talk about in a minute, really looking about at how we produce energy and food locally in a sustainable way. The interdependence network, so a community digital platform that would enable people to connect online to take action on climate change. And then this will be a little bit further down the road, but once we essentially be funding climate-focused solutions that might actually be able to slow temperature rises down, and also to train the next generation of sustainable focused entrepreneurs. So that's really how this concept fits together. A governance model, a funding mechanism, and then three key pillars. So, how are we going to do all that then? Well, the plan is really centered on this idea of an interdependence bond. And the idea there is that, we'll talk about this in a bit more detail, but people are making donations, and in exchange for their donations, they are receiving interdependence bonds, which is a form of essentially a digital token. Could describe it a little bit like a tokenized charity bond. And the money that is being raised from those donations is then going to fund predominantly climate resilient community infrastructure. So locally produced energy, sustainably produced food, climate solutions, and then also a digital platform that is designed to really help us get to scale. So let's talk a bit more about the bond, how it works. Okay, so first of all, somebody makes a donation, and that money is then received by the Interdependence Treasury that has been set up really specifically to manage funds and also to issue interdependence bonds. So the only time that these bonds are issued is when somebody is making a donation. So a key part of this concept is really the idea that with all the will in the world, individual donations are not going to enable us to get to massive scale. The vast majority of the world's money resides with institutional investors, pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, and many of these pension funds are actually managing money really for us, for our futures, and so it's certainly within their purview to be investing in sustainable infrastructure. In fact, many of them want to do that, but they can't find the supply of projects. So a key component here is to use that money that is crowd-funded from individual donations, almost like, and then to have it match-funded, hopefully to a much larger scale, by institutional investors. And then to use that money, that combined money, to essentially invest in that local infrastructure.
Sam, I do apologize. Is this PDF file will be available to us?
Yes, yeah, we'll make all the documents available so you can see it in more detail. And so once that infrastructure has been set up and we're at scale, then the idea is that the person who essentially made a donation in the first place and now who holds a bond can use that bond to exchange it for energy or food produced within that system. So you could think about it a little bit like a long-term investment, a little bit like a pension fund, where what you're really doing is helping support the creation of sustainable infrastructure assets, but also to have the ability to redeem that token for energy and food in the future.
Sorry, Sam. So is the
is the value of the food and energy they get equal to the value that they paid for the bond initially, or is it like an ongoing, like an interest kind of payment, or how does that work exactly?
Yeah, so it would be determined by the value of the bond at the time and the value of the food at the time.
Okay.
So we can't necessarily know exactly what those things would be today, so it's not a fixed.
So
rate.
it's something you cash in, is it? So let's say I buy one bond, 10 years later I cash it in and get X amount of energy and food, and then I need to buy another bond afterwards if I wanted to get more later on. Is it?
Yes, if you'd spent it all to get, then yes,
Okay.
you'd effectively need more, but just like money today.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Same idea. Yes. So sorry. So it's not like the idea of a. It's a separate idea, almost like a dividend. This is more just a transaction, so exchanging one thing for another. But I guess the core point here is that, and we'll talk more about this when we go into more detail on the bond on Thursday. But whatever happens, there will always be one place where you can definitely buy something with it, and that's essentially the infrastructure that was funded through the donation.
Sure.
Whether other institutions eventually accept it, we don't know. We can't guarantee that. Obviously, that's part of our plan. But for now, that's one place we can say.
Is the reason why this system should be implemented at a local level, because that will allow people to self-invest on local resources, and in those terms, you will not have the problem to gratify people in the future because they invest in something which is real, physically real, present in their own environment.
Was there a question in there, or was that just a statement?
I'm just stating that the idea is good. How do you? I buy bonds, and in the future I want to do something with them. But you said because there's no recognition yet, and you don't know if it will be a recognition in the future, because it could be cryptocurrency, a new type of cryptocurrency. But if the investing is done locally, if people invest locally, that money, for example, to build a new dam which exploit a small river to produce energy. These small projects are coming up everywhere in the Alps now, or to make a patch of forest more sustainable to exploit the wood. You will have a direct investment locally. People will be able to draw advantages at local level. But if you expand to
Yeah, I guess the idea with this is very much to be balancing the local and the global. So you want the people locally to be invested in and to have ownership and to feel an affiliation with the assets, but also to get to scale. If we were just raising money locally, for example, we probably wouldn't get very far. So it's trying to balance those two things. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we do that in a bit. So just to sort of recap them. So if somebody makes a donation, in exchange they receive bonds. Where possible, we will seek co-investment from institutional investors to get to greater scale. We then use that money to invest in infrastructure, and then the bondholders at a later date can redeem their bonds in exchange for energy or food produced by that system. So in terms of the valuation, so how do you value one of these bonds? So the idea is that the value of each of these bonds is backed by the basket of assets held by the Treasury. So there's a concept of the net asset value, or the NAV, which is commonly used and applied to funds. So really what you're looking at is the net asset value of the basket of assets. Now, if you invest, let's say £100 today in a solar panel, it will depreciate over time. However, if you are charging money for the electricity produced, so if it's a yield generating asset, if the yield is greater than the depreciation, you would expect that basket of assets to increase in value over time. And so what we really wanted to do was think about how you create something that is backed by something real, something useful, and that is not likely to experience sort of price volatility of something like Bitcoin, which is not based on anything. It's just supply and demand. There is no real world thing behind it. And part of the thinking was that linking it to a basket of renewable energy, sustainable food production assets that can generate a yield and that are useful may indeed enable it to increase slightly over time, which gives people an incentive to buy into it, but also makes it useful as an actual currency, although very far from that at this point.
One question: if you use the bond to buy the energy that the asset is creating, then how does the asset yield? Do you have to exploit it to other people as well to then make it yield, so that the people who had the bond initially can then not just essentially just run the asset into the ground, because you're only you see how the money sort of doubled up in one way, a bit like with the debt, almost in the way you're kind of creating it.
Yeah, so you wouldn't expect 100% of the sale of the produce to be done exclusively to the bondholders.
Yeah,
You'd also,
yeah.
unless we get to some situation where interdependence bonds become 100% of the money supply,
Right.
which is theoretically unlikely.
Yeah.
But at that point, you might say, well, why don't we just distribute the energy, in exchange for those bonds to the community, since the community owns them in the first place.
Yeah, so you're still looking to exploit the assets to outside of the interdependence. It's not closed circuit, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, makes
So
sense.
it might
Yeah.
be that, for example, the local producers, in order to receive investment in, say, local infrastructure, that they might be contractually obliged to accept bonds for up to 50% of the energy that they produce,
Yeah.
and the other 50% would be most likely sold to the market.
Yeah, makes sense.
So we talked a little bit earlier about the gold standard, and we used to have a gold standard, but we don't anymore. And so this is really thinking about almost trying to replicate that, but instead of, as nice as gold is, it doesn't actually produce things that you need, like food and energy. So this is really thinking about almost like a sustainable infrastructure standard or a backing. Okay, so talk a little bit more about how the money will be used. So really the thinking here is that 80% of the funds that are donated are almost always going to be going to build real world infrastructure that can generate a yield. To begin with, that's going to be more like 50%. So you know that for every £2 you donate, at least £1 will go into building that infrastructure. But the reality is that in order to get to scale to begin with, we have to divert slightly more money essentially to building the network platform, as that's really what helps us get to scale. So until the first 10 million has been raised, that number will be 50%. Thereafter, it will be 80, and it will remain at least 80, if not more, going forward. So just to recap, that's renewable energy, sustainable food. We're also looking at climate resilient housing, although that will come much later in the roadmap, as that is more complicated. But as you may be aware, climate change is going to make various parts of the world uninhabitable, and so people are going to need places to live. So the 20% is really looking at, they may be economically viable and yield generating, but they don't necessarily have to be. So for example, we could very well argue that planting trees and taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere is a worthwhile thing to do, but it might not generate any yield. It might if there's a carbon credit. Training young people to create businesses of the future may or may not generate a return, as would building essentially a not-for-profit focused social media platform designed to connect people that want to take action on climate change. If we're not relying on advertising revenue, it may not be a yield-generating asset. So that's really where the other 20% is going. So in a way, the idea is that a significant proportion of the money is being used to invest in assets that can sort of generate a yield to pay for the other stuff that we need to pay for, which would hopefully help accelerate solutions to climate change, but also growing this movement. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the bond and how that's working, and as I say, we'll go into more detail on that on Thursday. So now we're going to look at a little bit at the climate resilient communities. So what do we really mean by that? So first of all, just to touch on what a rapidly changing climate means. And we'll go into more detail on that on the deep adaptation workshop. But so just sort of going through them one at a time. So biodiversity collapse risks food shortages. And so a way to mitigate that is really moving to locally produced food. If we're not able to rely on global supply chains, arguably unsustainable supply chains, I mean, does it make sense to be importing bananas from the other side of the world when we could eat apples that are down the road? So ultimately, there are changes that we might want to think about in terms of what we eat, but also where does that food come from? In terms of energy supply disruption, so again, similar issue. Does it make sense to be importing oil or gas from faraway lands that happens to be very carbon intensive? Probably not. Certainly from an energy security point of view, and that's one key advantage of producing your energy locally is that it's you're less susceptible to foreign pressures. So yeah, ultimately producing energy locally makes sense for a raft of reasons, but in particular is a way of increasing climate resilience. And then ultimately political instability. Now, the civil war in Syria has been, obviously there was many factors that contribute to something happening, but they had just experienced one of the most significant droughts, and it's widely touted as one of the sort of first major conflicts really triggered this century by climate change. So that was a few million refugees coming into Europe. We saw various political instability. If we have 2 billion refugees seeking to leave essentially the center of the Earth, the equator, which is going to become increasingly uninhabitable, there is a lot of disruption potentially lying ahead. And so really part of this is about, rather than perhaps thinking, moving towards fascism or racism, can we be offering an alternative narrative, one that is actually about building something more positive? And that's ultimately part of where we're coming from with this interdependence piece.
One question. With the energy, the clean energy, I just wanted to ask you, is there still any research and development needed before it's actually, because isn't there a problem with the storage of the energy? Like we can't actually hold it in one place feasibly right now. Is that still a problem? I just wanted to ask you because I don't know.
I'll come back to that one in just a minute, because there's a few slides ahead. But
okay,
okay, so I mean, just partly to answer that question, but it is so one of the main sort of breakthroughs, if you like, over the last 20 years is that so there's been an awful lot of investment and trial and error, such that the technology has increased, or the efficiency of the technology has increased quite considerably, but also the cost has come down. And so it is very much possible to be putting solar panels on roofs of houses, and it really depends then on your energy use and whether or not you're south facing. There is now battery technology as well, which enables you to store energy locally, but it's really about economies of scale. So a large component of this project, and we'll talk a bit more about that, is it makes much more sense for a community of 100 or 200 homes to do something like this than it does for just one home and one house. And to be able to store energy collectively versus relying on a single battery pack.
Okay.
But by and large, technology is not the barrier, is I think where we're at, and that's been quite a recent development. So talked a little bit about energy. This is just an example of the case study we're using in a company that are based in Berlin. So my previous business was incubated by something called Climate Kick which is European Union funding for climate change startups. They are another graduate of that program. It's very impressive. In the centre of Berlin, they are currently producing considerable amounts of food in indoor greenhouses, which are then being sold to the wider community. So I guess the sort of key takeaways here really is that people are doing it. It is possible. Now, this just to kind of give a little bit of a context of the example of, in an urban setting, how we might think about moving towards more climate resilience. Obviously, in an urban environment, which may well be where this is more appropriate to start, might be easier, less people to get on board, more space, but just in an urban environment. So if we imagine here, we've got, so sort of, in my mind, where I used to live was a house, series of terraced houses, gardens at the back, both sides, road either side. You could be putting solar panels on all of those homes in one go. You could be knocking down what are currently individual gardens and building a communal greenhouse that could indeed feed everybody. And you could even think about moving to more of a communal garden setup, or even having some community space. If you think about, say, people who are getting a little bit older, maybe they're not able to tend to their garden. Maybe actually people would quite enjoy doing a timeshare where they might take it in turns to manage those kinds of assets. So this maybe just to go to sort of what you were just asking about there. So this is just to give you a little bit more of a context of so it's the levelized cost of energy, which is essentially how energy is talked about. And really what we can see, so this is for solar photovoltaic, and we've seen a considerable decline. This only goes up to 2016. It's carried on that trend. It's kind of interesting. I think when the history books are written, you've got the likes of Germany, for example. They put a massive investment into renewable energy and have really helped push that forward. So we're now at the point where solar is cheaper than fossil fuels in the majority of cases. So it doesn't, the old argument was, it's too expensive, we can't do that. That's just not true anymore. And when we look at wind, we see pretty much the same trend. So 61% decrease in cost there up until 2016. Again, that would have been going down more and more. The thing is that as more investment goes in, more economies of scale, more breakthroughs, and you end up with the cost just going down and down. I mean, at some point there will be a minimum cost to build these things, as there is with everything, but it's almost, we're not too far. We've crossed the most important threshold, which is that it is cheaper than fossil fuels. Now, if we remember back to what I was saying earlier about how the return on energy investment is actually going down and down and down for fossil fuels, where we're having to go to the ends of the earth, quite literally, to find harder and harder to extract fossil fuels, versus wind or solar, which is going down and down and down. I think my money is on solar and wind. Okay, so this is the point about batteries. This is potentially the most important of all of these bits of the jigsaw. We've almost been seeing a Moore's law in the space of battery storage. So Moore's law, it's doubling every, whatever it is, 18 months. So effectively, the technology has improved considerably, and also probably the most important thing is that the cost has come down an awful lot. Okay, so part of really what we would be looking to do with the interdependence concept in general, but specifically when we're looking at climate resilient communities, is taking existing proven solutions and helping them scale faster. So I'm not an expert in building solar panels, but there are people who are. And for example, if we look at Repowering London, they've built a considerable number of projects, particularly on social housing in London over the last few years. And so part of what we want to be doing with this is catalysing, as I say, existing solutions to take them to scale, and working with people who have extensive experience in developing these things. So another example I mentioned before, so ECF farm systems. So I think what's particularly interesting here, so they use a technique known as aquaponics, whereby the fish waste fertilizes the plants. So you have essentially almost a closed loop system. So a quarter of the size of a football field can feed 300 to 400 people per year on a fish plus vegetables diet. Now, if we go back to that example of knocking down gardens and putting greenhouses there, I think it's possible to feed people locally using the kinds of technology that we have. The bit that's missing at the moment is the support and the money. And this is just a few examples that of other projects that they've developed in Berlin, in Switzerland, Brussels as well. So they essentially, their model, having pioneered this, is to then help other projects scale. So this is pretty much what they do, their bread and butter. Okay, so then last part here really is just looking at the digital platform. So to explain a bit more about that and how this all comes together. Okay, so, sorry, wrong title there, but so essentially what we're looking to do is build a social media platform that is free from private profit interests and doesn't have any advertising. And instead of directing people's attention to either being addicted to the platform or buying things that they probably don't need, what we want to do is drive people towards sustainable behaviors that help us scale climate resilience. And the way that we're planning to do that is essentially by having the wallet for this system, so where your bonds live, but also time banking credits and community points. So I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second, but just to kind of give you some of the features. So the first feature that we're launching with is going to be called communities, and in particular the idea of spheres. So if you think about something like Facebook, it typically connects you to people that you already know. And arguably that is leading to a greater and greater echo chamber where we hear information from people that pretty much think like us and say the same things as us. What we're looking to do here, so we will likely at some point introduce a feature to enable you to connect to your friends, but to begin with, what we want to do is to enable people to connect to people where they live locally. So when you sign up, you don't have to give any information, but if you do, you can say what city you live in, perhaps your postcode, and be connected automatically to a sphere that connects you to other people in that area. And part of this, the reason for doing that, is to try and foster more collaboration and local action. Time banking, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but essentially the idea being that time banking credits live there, and then points. So one of the things we're doing is really taking some of the ideas from various tech companies out there around gamification. It turns out people love badges and points, and it sort of triggers something in our brains. So the thinking is, how can we use that to incentivize behavior that is actually leading to a more sustainable world? So there's just a couple of screenshots, just what it might look like as an app and a wallet. So, for example, just as I was mentioning in terms of points, so the idea being that every user's profile would have a little badge whereby the more activities that they're doing, which is leading towards, say, climate solutions, where we're, for example, planting trees, would increase the number of leaves on a tree until you actually have a complete tree. Or if you're involved in a local solar project and we're working towards getting one of those set up, and then we actually have one live, you'd have a complete solar badge, and then the same for a greenhouse where we're actually building food. So, time banking. So time banking is really a very simple concept, the idea being that 1 hour is the same for everyone, no matter what your skill is. So it might be that I teach somebody a French lesson for an hour and they teach me a Japanese lesson for an hour, so we're effectively trading time. Now, typically, time banking communities have been very local and not particularly high tech. What could be very interesting is if you have a much larger network, a few thousand people or a few million people, then the marketplace becomes a lot more diverse and rich. And so we're not just limited to what the people in the local area can exchange, but actually a much wider pool. Particularly with things like the internet, you can actually be doing a lot of things online now. So the idea essentially is to be creating a time banking facility whereby people can earn time banking credits for donating or volunteering, if you like, an hour within the community, or more than an hour, as well as people who are volunteering for existing not-for-profits that are essentially aligned with the mission statement of the organisation as a whole. So, the kinds of things we've talked about so far. And that is part of our scale-up strategy in partnering with existing volunteer networks that can invite their members to use this platform and provide them with a tool that is hopefully useful. Okay, so one of the, okay, we'll just give you a little bit of context before going into the slide. So one of the challenges for institutional investors is having projects that they can actually invest in. A lot of them are sitting on an awful lot of capital that they would love to invest, but the local projects are either too small or the risk-reward profile isn't quite right. So one of the things that we're trying to really solve with this project is to actually provide the supply of projects, to be an aggregator of projects and to help build up a diversified basket or portfolio so that we can then attract external capital from institutional investors. So the way somebody would do that is essentially use the platform to begin gathering local support and fundraising towards developing, whether it be solar or a sustainable food production system, that we can then crowdfund as a whole, but also bring in co-investment for. And so just a few points then on that. So to some extent, and this kind of goes to this point about the local versus the global. So at the moment, and we're still open to suggestion on this and refining it, but the idea would be that projects that have raised the most money for, or where you have the most local, essentially the most local support, either in terms of people being giving their permission, but also capital, having enough space to actually do it, having the right planning permission, and meeting the investment criteria, which essentially is that there may be projects that wouldn't normally be funded, that we would help to get off the ground, but ultimately they have to be self-sustaining going forward. Otherwise, the interdependence treasury isn't really doing a very good job at managing money on behalf of the community, if it's going down. That's not what we want. Okay, so then the last part really is looking at climate solutions. So you may have come across a book called Drawdown, somebody called Paul Hawken, and this is really a pretty comprehensive study of what kinds of technology and solutions are out there that could go the furthest towards reducing emissions. So actually, we're at the point now where we need to be taking carbon out of the atmosphere. We're already at 415 parts per million, potentially more if you include all the other greenhouse gases. And so this very handy book is really going through those kinds of solutions. And so there's a very long list. I've just taken a screenshot of the top 15. But we see things like refrigeration management, maybe not something that everyone was super familiar with, but turns out our fridges are full of rather horrible greenhouse gases. I don't actually know what happens to a fridge in this country when we dispose of it, but it could be that it just gets thrown on a pile. So it turns out that, we could save an awful lot of greenhouse gases if we were to manage those better. Some usual suspects: wind turbines, solar farms. Plant-rich diet, and then in at number 6, educating women and girls as well, particularly in the developing world. So there's a raft of things that we could be supporting. There's no end of solutions. It's really about mobilizing the capital. So just to give a little example then of what the Climate Solutions Fund would be investing in. So ultimately, mechanisms that can slow or reverse temperature rises, investing in the next generation of sustainable entrepreneurs. And so that really is how we would like to evolve the global climate change challenge over time, such that there would be almost like a accelerator program stream. And then ultimately things that can help the interdependence model scale up. So for example, if once at scale it was actually cheaper to have a not-for-profit entity that was producing some of the technology or hardware that was required, then it would make sense to bring that in-house, so to speak. How are we doing for time? Yeah. Okay. All right, so just want to talk then a little bit about, as the last section, how we aim to scale up this blueprint. So the first bit here is just really talking about the idea of the innovation diffusion curve that you may have come across elsewhere. It's talked about a lot, certainly in the startup world. And it's really this idea that almost every new idea, concept, technology passes through this wave, and that there are different segments that you can break it up into. So we have the innovators in the first 2.5%, typically the first people to come into contact with a new idea or technology. So the fact that you're all here suggests that maybe you're in this camp, or perhaps the next one, which would be the early adopters. And so those two groups are the kinds of people who maybe are a little bit more willing to forgive something not being 100% perfect or working 100% efficiency straight away. What is typically the challenge, however, is going from the innovators and the early adopters to that next segment, which is the early majority. And so that's typically known as crossing the chasm, which is in the sort of startup world as a challenging thing to do. But I think what's particularly interesting about this, and I think it's worth bearing in mind, is that the theory suggests that we move through these different segments in sequence. So you're never going to get the laggards on board with something first. So if you think you might have a friend who's still using a brick phone from the 80s, the sort of person who will never be the first one to do something new. Similarly, the late majority, so they will only do something when it's been validated by everyone else, the first 50%. And the early majority will only use a new technology platform or sign up something new when it's been validated by the innovators and the early adopters. Now, I think, so if you look at something like, you may be familiar with the Extinction Rebellion movement, so their key concept is that they need 3.5% of the population, which isn't too far off this 2.5 innovators, which has been proven, some data suggests that that's kind of the number of people you need to rebel against a regime in order to overthrow it. So I think that's kind of interesting that it follows this same path. But the reason I mention all of this is that with anything new, you don't need to convince everybody straight away. And I certainly know from my experience in the climate change arena, I've probably spent too much time debating with laggards that climate change is real. So I guess one of the things I want to just flag here is thinking very much about who are those innovators, who are those early adopters, and focusing time and energy on them. That's the most efficient strategy. So what is our adoption strategy? Well, first of all, it's making sure that those who donate early in the process, some of the terminologies I'm using here are a little bit like from the world of startups, because in a way this is a bit like a startup. It's just a not-for-profit where our business plan is try to create a better system rather than build a product. But ultimately, those who are supporting it early are taking on the greatest risk. So it seems only fair that those coming in early are also benefiting the most. So we've designed it such that early adopters benefit from those that are coming in later, so that it is fair across the board. We talked a little bit about gamification, so gamifying and rewarding user actions that help us achieve scale. That has worked very well for a number of technology companies out there. In particular, there's one called Ant Farm that is apparently one of the most successful Chinese apps ever. We have borrowed their tree idea for there. Ultimately, though, if we go back to that innovation chart, it's going to be about reaching other people who can help amplify the message. And as you may have seen, it turns out that everyone now has realized that we need to do something about the environment, which is good. So there are plenty of people with far more reach than myself, or probably any of us, who can help us amplify our message as we go. But ultimately, this is something that is very much about empowering the members of the community to take ownership of it and run with it. This is not something that I own or that anyone else involved in this project owns. It's a project for the community. And so that's very much something that we've tried to think about in our design, and we'll be trying to improve as we go. Now, one of the other things that we mentioned a few times is this kind of tension almost between the local and the global. And I think that our key to success is going to be in our ability to balance those two things. So one of the key roles that we see for the Interdependence Agency is aggregating those stories and telling the local message, but at a global level. Meanwhile, it's much easier for people perhaps to work in communities to be achieving tangible, real-world things that they can touch and feel. Okay, so this is sort of in the spirit of Elon Musk, who produced a secret master plan a few years ago. So this is essentially our plan in a few points, summarized as a few more bits and bobs in the background, but this is more or less what it is. So recruit, train, and support volunteers who can help us grow the movement through programs like this. Connect people who want to take action locally and globally through the technology platform that we're building. And I think what's really inspiring is that I think more and more people do want to do something. They just perhaps don't know exactly what to do. To then crowdfund the development of sustainable infrastructure assets. So that's donations from private individuals. To then issue interdependence bonds in exchange for those donations, which hold a value because they're based on the value of the assets. And then to use that money that has been donated to unlock co-investment from institutional investors who really do hold the vast majority of the world's capital. And that's how we will achieve scale. And then lastly, once we get to a sufficient scale, and this could well be our technique for crossing the chasm to scale to the mass market of people who maybe don't really want renewable energy, don't really want to do anything about climate change, but actually they'd be quite happy if they were getting paid in whether that be renewable energy or locally produced food to be getting involved. And so really the idea of a universal income being funded by the yields generated from this project. I have put the caveat there of once sufficient scale is achieved, we're talking in the trillions in order to finance that, but that is the long run objective. I think we might take a break now, or maybe we can finish this one actually. Yeah. How you guys doing? Do you want a little break?
Or maybe a few questions or something?
Yeah.
What we've had up to there.
Sure, good idea, yeah.
Maybe go through the values after that.
Does anyone have any questions?
Comments, observations?
Have you considered maybe that on the app, adverts might actually be a useful source of revenue, especially if it was like, I was wondering maybe what you could do is I mean, obviously you could bet, I don't know how it works exactly, you could bet the companies that are allowed to advertise on there to make sure that they in line with your values, or maybe you could say to users, you could turn adverts off if you want, no worries, but if you keep them on, we make a bit of extra money or something like that. It was just a thought I had when you were mentioning it.
Yeah, I guess it's, I feel like if you're trying to compete with the likes of Facebook, you need to have differentiators, and I think that's possibly one of the easiest ones maybe to differentiate on from a sort of values perspective, as I feel that the early adopters, innovators will probably come because of the values rather than the features.
Yeah.
The thing is not to compromise the integrity of something in pursuit of what might be an attractive short-term goal. Because you end up, I mean, even Facebook didn't have advertising for 10 years.
Right, okay.
The whole thing was like, make it cool, make it useful.
Yeah, fair enough.
I think that has to be like front and centre.
Sure.
Yeah, really not compromising it, because you end up compromising the values and something like that.
What's the next biggest like social media platform after Facebook in the UK? Like, what is it?
Instagram,
I think.
Which is owned by Facebook.
No, but I mean like an actual,
An alternative.
like a social media, not photo share. Like I mean something that's a bit like Facebook.
Yeah.
There
I
was
think LinkedIn. Be
maybe
closest to it, I think, but it's more professional.
the thing that
Yeah, but I mean something that's actually like friends or something that's akin to what you're trying to make.
So there was something that's like kind of fizzled out a bit, called Street Level or
Street life?
Street Life, is it?
Yeah.
It was kind of more about connecting locally than it was about connecting with everyone you knew.
And how many people did they get?
They got a lot, but I think it was more like people made an account in case it got to a certain size, rather
Do you
than
know the numbers?
not to hand. But
I'm just trying to see where like, so what would be your target for like the amount of people you want to get? Because basically, I suppose my point is that that's really hard. Like super difficult to create a whole other platform. Right? You know what I mean? Like the bar is set so high, and the likelihood that people are going to join another. They got Facebook, they got Instagram, they got Snapchat, they're fucking sick of it. Do you know what I mean? They're actually sick of social media platforms in a way.
Yeah.
So to try and build a whole one that's just like, okay, you like if you like climate change, you got to like join this whole new thing that you don't want to do. Like, you know what I mean? So yeah, I'm just trying to see how successful it could be by seeing what another one would be, or just find out like what, like 100,000, like 1 million, 2 million, 3 million. Like, what's the target?
Yeah, I mean there isn't. We haven't put a cap on the target.
No cap. You take anybody, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's.
What makes it useful, basically? Is what
I mean,
I'm
I guess
saying.
people are going to go to it to look at the information
It's
about
going
the
to
bonds
be a
they
huge
bought
investment
and
of
everything
time
as
and
well.
money.
Yeah.
Like, is it only useful when there's like 5,000?
No, this is the point that the model is designed in such a way that it could work in a community of 150 people.
Oh, okay, fantastic.
Or it
Yeah,
could work
that's
across a huge network. So the idea is that we end up with these nodes.
Yeah.
So Sam was talking a bit about the communities portal and these spheres, and the idea is that when these spheres become populated to a certain extent, they become eligible for applying for funding.
Yeah.
So like when 150 people in your postcode area have signed up, then all those people get an alert to say you are now eligible to apply for this investment, and then the idea is that it works for even if it's just 150 people in the entire world, but they're all concentrated in one area, it still works for them.
Yeah, so there's lower risk of investing a lot of time and money into something that just isn't
Well, the
extremely useful.
the barrier to entry isn't that high. Like, it's not millions to build a social network that does what we want to do. It's hundreds of thousands.
Yeah.
Low hundreds of thousands. I guess the point potentially is that, I mean, yes, you are ultimately trying to compete with a behemoth, but Facebook's taken an absolute hammering over the last couple of years, and I think people are sick of social media. And I think that's partly because of advertising, it's partly because of how it's being used, and people are waking up. We've just seen a massive green surge across Europe to the climate emergency, And I guess what we're trying to do is ride that wave, but also provide something useful. But our strategy doesn't require us to get to millions within the next few months. What we do need to do, though, is have people get involved in local projects.
Yeah.
Now, if we're providing a tool that is fit for purpose to help them do that, I think that's a reason for them to use it.
Yeah.
But the key idea really is that so first of all, people will be getting a time banking feature that they can use for free, but also it'll be where their bonds live. So it's a bit like if your wallet lives on a platform. So that's kind of the reason we think people might come to us, because that'll be the only place they can access their wallet.
So is that the only way they could donate as well then, is if they're a member of the social media platform?
Yeah.
That's quite clever.
Yeah,
Get
that's the kind of like...
Create an account.
And you only have to put in a token amount, £1 or something, and then you get that immediately back in bond on your account. So
Yeah.
you're already like invested in it as
Yeah.
soon as you make an account, so there's already some kind of like purchase on people who like join up.
Yeah, it makes sense, like a nudge.
Going back to the generation of renewable energies, like locally, are we talking about, for example, because I'm just trying to understand, and we'll be working with companies like Octopus Energy, like they're completely green, or will be us, doing the project like more directly, like buying just land and maybe connecting with other people that knows how to do like a solar farm, or is more linked, to the companies that they are already doing it?
Sure, it's a good question. So the idea is to create additional capacity that creates resilience. So us, for example, buying some energy from a renewable company is not necessarily as useful to create resilience as solar panels on roofs, a physical thing. So so the idea is we would, it starts with getting support from the community and having enough funding, but then it would be working with
People that knows how to
exactly like contractors that do that professionally.
The solutions exist, right? Like, all these companies that build this stuff, they all exist. They just need to be the ones that we're targeting like investment in. So we become like a kind of aggregating investment vehicle that just targets money to these companies and just scales them up. As long as they're aligned with our kind of principles of investment.
Perhaps these companies themselves are suffering for the inability to reach out and convince people about the utility of their products. So, what about joining with them and asking them which solution they
this is a big part of the partner building is a big
put
part
it
of this.
into place, and if you say, well, we can guarantee 1 year time we have 200 people that will look seriously into this. Can you drop the price? What can you do?
Yeah, well, this is part of the thesis, is that if you can achieve economies of scale, so if people are combining their money and then you're doing it at 200 or 400 houses, then you can negotiate much better prices.
But what I'm trying to say is, instead to move unidirectionally, to try to build first in order to get to gather the curiosity or the interest in this company. What about moving bi-directionally? In one way, you do what you're now saying, trying to build up numbers. At the same time, work sideways, work with this company to find strategies to build the numbers by introducing products and solutions.
I think maybe it's helpful to think of the interdependence agency or like the bundle of companies as not actually providing physical solutions, but rather scaling other companies. And
I'm in line with that. I agree, because it is, you only have two when.
We focus on what we can do and where.
Perhaps I should rephrase. In the building up of the number of people that will follow this program.
Let's do it the other way around. So instead of just us supporting them, they support us as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what you mean.
Yeah.
Try to
So yeah, I mean that's definitely part of the partnership building
Because
strategy. I
the
think. Like,
project I'm running now in Italy, for example, is to use forestry to build up energy locally, not just to produce power, but to warm up houses. Yeah, but in order to do that, I have to go to companies that produce stoves, and they're asking them which kind of wood you can burn, which kind of pallets. Pallets.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Which kind of wood we can use locally to produce pallets. So we are basically masterminding on a reverse. Instead of have a fixed product with a fixed type of wood, we are trying to understand, looking on the area, which kind of wood is over there to produce specific products and having specific stoves,
Sure.
which means investment, local investment. In the long term, you will have locally they will be resilient forever.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, these solutions have to be tailored to the local situation.
Yeah.
You know, what works in one locality doesn't work in another. But one of the advantages of like aggregating interest and demand with the platform that we're talking about is that we're able to collect all that information from our communities, from people who are on the ground who know the environment. That's the whole point of like making it as local as possible, so that it's as clear as can be as an investment proposal to A, fund managers, and B, service providers. So we're directing the right service companies into the right places based on the most accurate information, which is like what's on the ground, who wants what, where.
Because it was interesting to see also the reaction of people. Like if you see a stove, the stove is seen as a product, something I have to buy because it's a product, not as an investment. It's not just a stove; it's an investment for which I invest my future on it. Because I'm using local resources, and I allow myself to be resilient. I don't have to ask to anybody else to work on my house. It's there. The forest is there. The stove is here. And so.
Yeah. I mean, we're definitely trying to get away from this idea of ownership in the private sense. I mean, not to the kind of full communism now sense, but the idea that the community owns all of these assets and manages them on behalf of everybody means that there is less emphasis on the individual owning stuff and being responsible for the generation of the things that they need. It's sort of aggregated responsibility across everybody. So hopefully that's sort of built into the sort of messaging that this isn't about one individual over another, it's about collective effort and collective responsibility. Yeah.
Does anyone have any more questions?
Yeah, I'm a little confused about, on the social media platform, the relative weight that is placed on people joining the network and joining communities versus the weight placed on like building your points through the time banking and through bonds and stuff. Which how they kind of work together to then produce funding.
Yeah, so okay, maybe the best way to think about it is it's kind of all the same thing. So somebody makes a donation, they get bonds, and their bonds live in their digital wallet, which is associated with their account and their profile. And so if we wanted to trade or give each other bonds, we could do that. Time banking credits, again, it's sort of administered through the platform, but it's actually an offline. Most of it will be an offline activity. So you went to do the shopping for somebody, and they, I don't know, cleaned the windows or whatever it was. There'd be a trade there, and then the unit of account would be recorded on the platform. And then the points, essentially, that really is a way of gamifying behaviors. So, for example, it's really things that help grow the community, improve the community, or that lead to a kind of sustainable outcome. So, for example, it would be a much richer experience if people put their address in there and then they can be connected to local communities, or if they join a local community, or if they create a new group. So those sorts of things would get points, as would saying, oh yes, I want to take the lead on building a solar farm or something, or in the area. That would be the kind of thing that would lead to being given more points. So it's kind of all integrated into essentially 3 wallets, or one big wallet with 3 different units in it.
So
Does that make sense?
there's also, a lot of this is to be, there's a lot of potential for development on these different streams. One of the avenues that we're kind of thinking about and looking at is this idea that there are some people in communities who should be rewarded for community activity, even if it doesn't have a financial benefit. So if somebody is a particularly effective community organiser, is there a way that we can reward that person with actual bonds, so access to money and food, even if their activities, starting youth groups or whatever it is, if that can be rewarded by everyone in the community through points, and then those points can be converted into bonds, therefore creating a kind of level playing field between what would traditionally be referred to as like yield producing and like community yield producing. So if you kind of create some kind of conversion mechanism between that, so that there's an incentive for people to be more community oriented rather than like financially oriented.
Yeah.
That's really what we're trying to like build into people's minds, that kind of equivalency. But yeah, there's all these things are kind of we fleshed out the scaffold, and there's like detail that needs the crowd's input.
If I summarise what I think, what you said, and you tell me, no, you're wrong, basically, you want to use the social media network and volunteers and sustainable entrepreneurs to develop projects, essentially. You're not going to necessarily say this is the project. You're looking to aggregate the projects and then sit in the middle between the institutional money and the projects, and just essentially make sure they've got enough money to run, and just get like the big money involved. So you're like, there's all these people that are like good-minded and nicely minded towards the good things about sustainability and fixing the planet. We'll get all those people in a cohesive thing, interdependence, and then we can sit in the middle with our core competence and
Direct that.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're not looking to, okay, good. So you're not actually looking to develop the project, come with the idea of the project. You want that to come from people themselves.
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, we've got 3 themes.
Yeah.
So or to keep it simple, renewable energy, locally produced food.
Yeah.
Because our mission is to scale climate resilience.
Yeah.
But what exactly that looks like is going to be determined by people that know far more about it than we do.
Yeah.
And on the ground, it might make sense to do something in this place and something completely different over here. What we're really about trying to do is aggregate it in a way that means we can unlock more money from institutional investors.
That's your core competence,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah, that's kind of that's what the bond is, and that's also where the innovation is. This bond idea.
Yeah.
But in order to kind of make that happen, we have to have a platform for people to come together, and we have to kind of grow a movement as well. That's the key ingredient. So
Yeah, because Bob at the end of the road with his greenhouse isn't going to. The guy in the suit with all the millions of pounds doesn't give him a lot of time credit or whatever. So
And you
can
kind
build
of
it
need
up into something that they will actually look at.
and you kind of need 100 Bobs in the same area.
Yes, yeah, for
That's-
them to even start caring.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry,
No, that's
I just want to make sure I kind of get it in my way, in my brain.
Did anyone? Did you have a question over there? Are you going to ask something?
So, for example, with like a community solar thing, there was like 100 bonds, and then that was matched by some investment company. Would the community people, would they have to pay back the big investment company? And
So-
then after that point, would they own solar panels and not have to pay any money for the energy produced by them?
Yeah. So the idea is that so whatever the terms were for the fund. So effectively, the way we look to do it is that So a similar example would be, sorry, just give me a few numbers. So let's say you've got 5% of the money that's coming from the interdependence treasury. You would take that money effectively to, plus the projects, to an institutional investment house or whatever it was, get them to structure a fund where we would be almost like the, yeah, or like essentially we're the client, we're the asset owner, and the idea is that other people are investing on our same terms, but we're sort of setting those terms. Obviously, we'd have to do it in working out what we're actually going to be able to, balance in order to get the money to come in. But the idea is that everyone would be getting the same deal, and for the independent agency to be owning, whatever it might be, like 5% or more of that fund, but to dictate the terms. So, for example, how much the energy is being sold for. And if a certain amount has to be sold in interdependence bonds. Does that make sense?
So the interdependence agency owns the panels themselves, or just the fund?
Effectively, the fund would, but you would structure it in a way such that it's being managed and essentially for the community. Or by the community for the community, but the Independence Treasury is doing that on behalf of those donors.
So if you if you need to fix something, you can take some money from the fund and do it like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Some of the yield has to go back to the investor wants an ROI though, right? They're not just giving money away. Some of the yield goes to them.
Because we're pitching it at this kind of institutional money that's based on a 2 to 5% long-term sustainable return, pension funds, that kind of.
Yeah.
But they only invest in projects of a certain scale. That's why they put loads of money into like massive offshore wind, massive offshore solar.
Yeah.
The problem with that is it's like super centralized.
Yeah.
So that just feeds into the grid, very like susceptible to climate shocks.
Yeah.
There is no mechanism to aggregate the local projects that we're talking about that puts the asset class right next to the people who are going to use it for the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years.
Yeah.
And the pitch to them is that like we have aggregated this demand for you, and you can help us scale these projects.
But they're looking for 2 to 5% to be for your projects to be competitive against all the other investments that they're getting pitched to them. Between 2 to 5% is what would need to be there.
Yeah, which is achievable. That's what existing projects are achieving. I mean, there are various sort of social bond charity investment type structures, particularly in the UK, and there are various terms that can be set. So essentially, the objective of what we're trying to do is safeguard the values and the principles, but unlock that capital. So it's not like they could then sell it off and turn it into something else. That's the kind of thing that would you wouldn't be able to do that. Yeah.
So do you separate? They invest in treasury, and then the independence treasury actually then puts that money through, rather than directly.
At the moment,
they don't have ownership.
So at the moment, we're looking to create a fund structure, which would be set up by or on behalf of the independence treasury. We would put some money into that, and then others would invest into that. The exact terms and conditions will be worked out once we've got 100 million on the table.
How much are you expecting to start? How much?
So I think that we need 5 million that we have raised to then unlock another 95 using some comparable examples. So if you think about roughly having 5 to 10%, I think once we've got past 5 million, we can start to have quite serious conversations and start making it happen. But before that, it's harder.
Yeah. So they invest in the fund, not necessarily the project directly. They invest in your fund, and then your treasury will then manage that money to all of these projects.
Yeah.
So they're kind of ring-fenced off. So so it's all separated away.
Yeah, I mean that's quite often how things are structured, just to sort of also safeguard any one entity if one of them fails. I think we should go through this now because it's about half an hour, and then have a break for lunch. And I believe the next webinar is at 1:30. Yeah, great.
Do some audio.
Yeah, and we'll sort out the sound. Okay.
When possible later to ask them to put the volume a bit down.
Yeah, I mean, you can go and ask them now if you want. Do you want to ask?
Annoying, isn't it?
Do you want to ask? I'll wait till you come back. Yeah, it's not quite as soundproof.
But it is visual proof. Like if you're standing outside, it looks like a blank screen.
Oh, really?
Which is quite cool. Yeah. Feels like we're in this Bond movie or something.
Did you say that you spoke to Raoul and that you had
Yeah,
some?
they're going to call me at 12:30.
Right.
So we'll go with them.
Okay.
But what they're suggesting is to set up a phone as
What that calls in?
yeah, and becomes the microphone.
Oh, right. Okay. All right. Well, I reckon if we try restarting it all, it might sometimes that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then if that doesn't work.
Does anyone have anything else they want to ask?
I wanted to ask something because to me it seems like there's a lot of like individualism, which I think is kind of one of, well, not the goal to have individualism, but like communities as leaders. And I was kind of wondering, like, would you think about offering like training for like starting these like projects within communities, or like, I don't know, connecting communities to like providers of training for how to start like a project on like building a solar farm or wind farm.
When you say individualism, do you mean like the tone of what we're saying sounds like it's offers individuals? Is that what you mean?
More just that there's like a lot of power in the individual in this scheme, more than like companies coming in and implementing ideas that they've implemented everywhere else. It's kind of like ideas that someone or a group of 100 people wouldn't have like ever done before. So they might need like some help with doing it more than just on like a financial level.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think that's kind of the that's slightly the sort of the purpose of the Interdependence Agency, is kind of like helping people on that journey, and then trying to kind of aggregate the learnings from all these different groups to then share back across the network. I mean, I think it depends what people are doing. So if you're doing a kind of let's say less technical climate resilience project, then that might be something that people can kind of do. Whereas installing, I don't know, 200 solar panels, probably someone's going to need to have done that before, and otherwise they end up getting electrocuted. So that's kind of where it's most likely going to be a professional entity that knows what they're doing.
The idea is like focus on what we know and can do, and then just get people who do know what they're doing in other areas to do that, because there's no point like duplicating learning, duplicating.
So like connecting a community that wants to do a project to like
rather than reskilling everybody to do
So
everything.
that's kind of what the Global Climate Change Challenge longer term is really meant to be about. So the idea that we almost want to build up like a sort of wiki resource bank of like, oh, this is how you do a local vegetable garden in this type of place in this part of the world. These people have done it. Here's a YouTube tutorial. Here's the person talking about it. Now you can go and do it. That sort of thing. Sort of trying to empower people to do that. If everyone's ready, we can go to the next bit.
How far away is social media from being
So we so there's Raoul, who you'll probably meet at some point, he's working on the technical side. We're adding new bits of it at the moment, but realistically it's probably another £50,000 of money raised away from launch. So we're hoping Q4 this year. Yeah, maybe a little bit earlier, depending on how quickly we go. All right, so I'm going to go into this next section just before lunch, and then we can have a break and sort out the technical stuff. So ultimately, the idea behind interdependence is very much that anyone can join and get involved and really make it their own, so long as they are respecting the values of the community. So to explain what those values are. So number one, interdependence. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but really this idea that we need to respect the fact that we live on a finite planet with finite resources, and our actions can in fact affect the whole. So it's in the name, it's also one of our values. Awareness. So I think really in terms of addressing any problem, it helps to start from a position of grounded awareness, what is actually going on, and from there hopefully to think about effective solutions. And when we say awareness, that's not just external awareness but also our own internal awareness. So being aware of what's going on inside ourselves is a sort of one step towards making sure that we're being conscious in how we're acting in the community. So empowerment, we talked a little bit earlier about this idea of sustainable leadership. It's very much an idea of empowering others rather than this being a top-down movement that is sort of, we have all the answers and this is what we have to do. That's absolutely not what this is. We definitely don't have all the answers, that's for sure. But what we have tried to do is come up with a framework that we hope can scale and that others can take ownership of as it grows. Impact. So this is very much the idea that we want to be data-driven and to prioritize impact over ideology at all times. So just because we think something or we feel that something is good or bad, actually we should look at the data and focus on that. We've tried to come up with 7 principles because that will fit nicely into our logo. So we've made, otherwise this would be 2. But empathy. So I think empathy is very important, and maybe we could do with a bit more empathy in general in our society. But it's very much the idea of putting ourselves in the shoes of others. And for example, you may have seen certain non-violent direct action movements like Extinction Rebellion. A core idea of their identity is not to blame or to have arguments with people, but really to try and understand where it is that they're coming from, even if they are in conflict with what it is that we're proposing and saying. So it's very important. And respect, well, I think that's hopefully a pretty obvious one, but the way that manifests itself, for example, is trying to use things like non-violent communication. So I think, I feel, rather than that's rubbish, which doesn't really sound very nice if someone's saying that to you. So, people's feelings do matter. So that's that. And then integrity. So ultimately, making sure that what we're doing is in alignment with our values, but that we're being transparent, accountable, making sure that really runs through. Openness, so really being inclusive of diversity, different ideas, people of different backgrounds, new inputs, again, is very important. I think that's really how progress can be made. So just to summarize, so interdependence, really thinking about an update to our value system that safeguards against behaviours that materially threaten the way of life for any other member of society. We could argue that at the moment we don't have that. We have a system that seems to be full of behaviours going on that are actually materially threatening the way of life for others. So awareness, cultivating awareness, enabling others, being data-driven in our approach to impact, empathy, certainly putting ourselves in other people's shoes, not blaming, being polite, being respectful of other people's feelings. And that's particularly important when giving feedback to others. So we'll be doing a workshop on that at some point. Honesty, transparency, accountability. And this is something that we very much plan to include in the governance of all interdependence agencies. And openness, so being open to new ideas, feedback. So this may well be something that gets added to over time by members of the community, but this is the starting batch of values and principles. I think Yes, that was the end of that. If any of you want to find us on social media, these are the ones at the moment which you can use. I think for now we will have a break before lunch.